This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 32. Two Stubborn People. Rosemary West, on her way home from a music lesson at Ingleside, turned aside to the hidden spring in Rainbow Valley. She had not been there all summer. The beautiful little spot had no longer any allurement for her. The spirit of her young lover never came to the tryst now, and the memories connected with John Meredith were too painful and poignant. But she had happened to glance backward up the valley, and had seen Norman Douglas vaulting as airily as a stripling over the old stone dike of the Bailey garden, and thought he was on his way up the hill. If he overtook her, she would have to walk home with him, and she was not going to do that. So she slipped at once behind the maples of the spring, hoping he had not seen her and would pass on. But Norman had seen her, and, what was more, was in pursuit of her. He had been wanting for some time to have a talk with Rosemary, but she had always, so it seemed, avoided him. Rosemary had never at any time liked Norman Douglas very well. His bluster, his temper, his noisy hilarity had always antagonized her. Long ago she had often wondered how Ellen could possibly be attracted to him. Norman Douglas was perfectly aware of her dislike, and he chuckled over it. It never worried Norman if people did not like him. It did not even make him dislike them in return, for he took it as a kind of extorted compliment. He thought Rosemary a fine girl, and he meant to be an excellent, generous brother-in-law to her. But before he could be her brother-in-law, he had to have a talk with her. So, having seen her leaving Ingleside as he stood in the doorway of a Glen store, he had straightway plunged into the valley to overtake her. Rosemary was sitting pensively on the maple seat where John Meredith had been sitting on that evening nearly a year ago. The tiny spring shimmered and dimpled under its fringe of ferns. Ruby-red gleams of sunset fell through the arching boughs. A tall clump of perfect asters grew at her side. The little spot was as dreamy and witching and evasive as any retreat of fairies and dryads in ancient forests. Into it Norman Douglas bounced, scattering and annihilating its charm in a moment. His personality seemed to swallow the place up. There was simply nothing there but Norman Douglas, big, red-bearded, complacent. "Good evening," said Rosemary coldly, standing up. "Evening, girl. Sit down again, sit down again. I want to have a talk with you. Bless the girl, what's she looking at me like that for? I don't want to eat you. I've had my supper. Sit down and be civil." "I can hear what you have to say quite as well here," said Rosemary. "So you can, girl, if you use your ears. I only wanted you to be comfortable. You look so derned uncomfortable standing there. Well, I'll sit anyway." Norman accordingly sat down in the very place John Meredith had once sat. The contrast was so ludicrous that Rosemary was afraid she would go off into a peal of hysterical laughter over it. Norman cast his hat aside, placed his huge red hands on his knees, and looked up at her with his eyes a twinkle. "Come, girl, don't be so stiff," he said ingratiatingly. When he liked, he could be very ingratiating. "Let's have a reasonable, sensible, friendly chat. There's something I want to ask you. Ellen says she won't, so it's up to me to do it." Rosemary looked down at the spring, which seemed to have shrunk to the size of a dewdrop. Norman gazed at her in despair. "Durn it all, you might help a fellow out a bit," he burst forth. "What is it you want me to help you say?" asked Rosemary scornfully. "You know as well as I do, girl. Don't be putting on your tragedy airs. No wonder Ellen was scared to ask you. Look here, girl. Ellen and I want to marry each other. That's plain English, isn't it? Got that? And Ellen says she can't, unless you give her back some tomfool promise she made. Come now, will you do it? Will you do it?" "Yes," said Rosemary. Norman bounced up and seized her reluctant hand. "Good! I knew you would. I told Ellen you would. I knew it would only take a minute. Now, girl, you go home and tell Ellen, and we'll have a wedding in a fortnight, and you'll come and live with us. We shan't leave you to roost on that hilltop like a lonely crow, don't you worry. I know you hate me, but Lord, it'll be great fun living with someone that hates me. Life will have some spice in it after this. Ellen will roast me, and you'll freeze me. I won't have a dull moment." Rosemary did not condescend to tell him that nothing would ever induce her to live in his house. She let him go striding back to the glen, oozing delight and complacency, and she walked slowly up the hill home. She had known this was coming ever since she had returned from Kingsport and found Norman Douglas established as a frequent evening caller. His name was never mentioned between her and Ellen, but the very avoidance of it was significant. It was not in Rosemary's nature to feel bitter, or she would have felt very bitter. She was coldly civil to Norman, and she made no difference in any way with Ellen. But Ellen had not found much comfort in her second courtship. She was in the garden, attended by St. George, when Rosemary came home. The two sisters met in the dahlia walk. St. George sat down on the gravel walk between them, and folded his glossy black tail gracefully around his white paws, with all the indifference of a well-fed, well-bred, well-groomed cat. "Did you ever see such dahlias?" demanded Ellen proudly. "They are just the finest we've ever had." Rosemary had never cared for dahlias. Their presence in the garden was her concession to Ellen's taste. She noticed one huge mottled one of crimson and yellow that lorded it over all the others. "That dahlia," she said, pointing to it, "is exactly like Norman Douglas. It might easily be his twin brother." Ellen's dark-browed face flushed. She admired the dahlia in question, but she knew Rosemary did not, and that no compliment was intended. But she dared not resent Rosemary's speech. Poor Ellen dared not resent anything just then. And it was the first time Rosemary had ever mentioned Norman's name to her. She felt that this portended something. "I met Norman Douglas in the valley," said Rosemary, looking straight at her sister, "and he told me you and he wanted to be married, if I would give you permission." "Yes? What did you say?" asked Ellen, trying to speak naturally and offhandedly, and failing completely. She could not meet Rosemary's eyes. She looked down at St. George's sleek back, and felt horribly afraid. Rosemary had either said she would or she wouldn't. If she would, Ellen would feel so ashamed and remorseful that she would be a very uncomfortable bride-elect, and if she wouldn't, well, Ellen had once learned to live without Norman Douglas, but she had forgotten the lesson, and felt that she could never learn it again. "I said that as far as I was concerned, you were at full liberty to marry each other as soon as you liked," said Rosemary. "Thank you," said Ellen, still looking at St. George. Rosemary's face softened. "I hope you'll be happy, Ellen," she said gently. "Oh, Rosemary!" Ellen looked up in distress. "I'm so ashamed. I don't deserve it, after all I said to you." "We won't speak about that," said Rosemary, hurriedly and decidedly. But, persisted Ellen, "you are free now, too, and it's not too late. John Meredith—" "Ellen West!" Rosemary had a little spark of temper under all her sweetness, and it flashed forth now in her blue eyes. "Have you quite lost your senses in every respect? Do you suppose for an instant that I am going to go to John Meredith and say meekly, 'Please, sir, I've changed my mind, and please, sir, I hope you haven't changed yours'? Is that what you want me to do? No, no! But a little encouragement, he would come back. Never. He despises me, and rightly. No more of this, Ellen. I bear you no grudge. Marry whom you like, but no meddling in my affairs." "Then you must come and live with me," said Ellen. "I shall not leave you here alone." Do you really think that I would go and live in Norman Douglas's house?" "Why not?" cried Ellen, half angrily, despite her humiliation. Rosemary began to laugh. "Ellen, I thought you had a sense of humor. Can you see me doing it?" "I don't see why you wouldn't. His house is big enough. You'd have your share of it to yourself. He wouldn't interfere." "Ellen, the thing is not to be thought of. Don't bring this up again." "Then," said Ellen coldly and determinedly, "I shall not marry him. I shall not leave you here alone. That is all there is to be said about it." "Nonsense, Ellen." "It is not nonsense. It is my firm decision. It would be absurd for you to think of living here by yourself, a mile from any other house. If you won't come with me, I'll stay with you. Now we won't argue the matter, so don't try." "I shall leave Norman to do the arguing," said Rosemary. "I'll deal with Norman. I can manage him. I would never have asked you to give me back my promise. Never. But I had to tell Norman why I couldn't marry him, and he said he would ask you. I couldn't prevent him. You need not suppose you are the only person in the world who possesses self-respect. I never dreamed of marrying and leaving you here alone, and you'll find I can be as determined as yourself." Rosemary turned away and went into the house, with a shrug of her shoulders. Ellen looked down at St. George, who had never blinked an eyelash or stirred a whisker during the whole interview. "St. George, this world would be a dull place without the men, I'll admit, but I'm almost tempted to wish there wasn't one of 'em in it. Look at the trouble and bother they've made right here, George. Torn our happy old life completely up by the roots, Saint. John Meredith began it, and Norman Douglas has finished it. And now both of them have to go into limbo. Norman is the only man I ever met who agrees with me that the Kaiser of Germany is the most dangerous creature alive on this earth, and I can't marry this sensible person because my sister is stubborn and I'm stubborner. Mark my words, St. George, the minister would come back if she raised her little finger, but she won't, George. She'll never do it. She won't even crook it, and I don't dare meddle, Saint. I won't sulk, George. Rosemary didn't sulk, so I'm determined I won't either, Saint. Norman will tear up the turf, but the long and short of it is, St. George, that all of us old fools must just stop thinking of marrying. Well, well, despair is a free man, hope is a slave, Saint. So now come into the house, George, and I'll solace you with a saucerful of cream. Then there will be one happy and contented creature on this hill at least." End of chapter 32. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 33. Carl is not whipped. "There is something I think I ought to tell you," said Mary Vance mysteriously. She and Faith and Una were walking arm in arm through the village, having foregathered at Mr. Flagg's store. Una and Faith exchanged looks, which said, "Now something disagreeable is coming." When Mary Vance thought she ought to tell them things, there was seldom much pleasure in the hearing. They often wondered why they kept on liking Mary Vance, for like her they did, in spite of everything. To be sure, she was generally a stimulating and agreeable companion, if only she would not have those convictions that it was her duty to tell them things. "Do you know that Rosemary West won't marry your pa because she thinks you are such a wild lot? She's afraid she couldn't bring you up right, and so she turned him down." Una's heart thrilled with secret exultation. She was very glad to hear that Miss West would not marry her father. But Faith was rather disappointed. "How do you know?" she asked. "Oh, everybody's saying it. I heard Mrs. Elliott talking it over with Mrs. Doctor. They thought I was too far away to hear, but I've got ears like a cat's. Mrs. Elliott said she hadn't a doubt that Rosemary was afraid to try stepmothering you because you'd got such a reputation. Your pa never goes up the hill now. Neither does Norman Douglas. Folks say Ellen has jilted him just to get square with him for jilting her ages ago. But Norman is going about declaring he'll get her yet. And I think you ought to know. You've spoiled your pa's match, and I think it's a pity, for he's bound to marry somebody before long, and Rosemary West would have been the best wife I know of for him." "You told me all stepmothers were cruel and wicked," said Una. "Oh, well," said Mary rather confusedly, "they're mostly awful cranky, I know. But Rosemary West couldn't be very mean to anyone. I tell you, if your pa turns round and marries Emmeline Drew, you'll wish you'd behaved yourselves better, and not frightened Rosemary out of it. It's awful that you've got such a reputation that no decent woman'll marry your pa on account of you. Of course, I know that half the yarns that are told about you ain't true, but give a dog a bad name. Why, some folks are saying that it was Jerry and Carl that threw the stones through Mrs. Stimson's window the other night, when it was really them two Boyd boys. But I'm afraid it was Carl that put the eel in old Mrs. Carr's buggy, though I said at first I wouldn't believe it until I'd better proof than old Kitty Alec's word. I told Mrs. Elliott so right to her face." "What did Carl do?" cried Faith. "Well, they say, now mind, I'm only telling you what people say, so there's no use in your blaming me for it, that Carl and a lot of other boys were fishing eels over the bridge one evening last week. Mrs. Carr drove past in that old rattle-trap buggy of hers with the open back, and Carl he just up and threw a big eel into the back. When poor old Mrs. Carr was driving up the hill by Ingleside, that eel came squirming out between her feet. She thought it was a snake, and she just give one awful screech and stood up and jumped clean over the wheels. The horse bolted, but it went home and no damage was done. But Mrs. Carr jarred her legs most terrible, and has had nervous spasms ever since whenever she thinks of the eel. Says it was a rotten trick to play on the poor old soul. She's a decent body, if she is as queer as Dick's hatband." Faith and Una looked at each other again. This was a matter for the Good Conduct Club. They would not talk it over with Mary. "There goes your pa," said Mary, as Mr. Meredith passed them, "and never seeing us no more'n if we weren't here. Well, I'm getting so's I don't mind, but there are folks who do." Mr. Meredith had not seen them, but he was not walking along in his usual dreamy and abstracted fashion. He strode up the hill in agitation and distress. Mrs. Alec Davis had just told him the story of Carl and the eel. She had been very indignant about it. Old Mrs. Carr was her third cousin. Mr. Meredith was more than indignant. He was hurt and shocked. He had not thought Carl would do anything like this. He was not inclined to be hard on pranks of heedlessness or forgetfulness, but this was different. This had a nasty tang in it. When he reached home he found Carl on the lawn, patiently studying the habits and customs of a colony of wasps. Calling him into the study, Mr. Meredith confronted him, with a sterner face than any of his children had ever seen before, and asked him if the story were true. "Yes," said Carl, flushing, but meeting his father's eyes bravely. Mr. Meredith groaned. He had hoped that there had been at least exaggeration. "Tell me the whole matter," he said. "The boys were fishing for eels over the bridge," said Carl. "Link Drew had caught a whopper, I mean an awful big one, the biggest eel I ever saw. He caught it right at the start, and it had been lying in his basket a long time, still as still. I thought it was dead, honest I did. Then old Mrs. Carr drove over the bridge, and she called us all young varmints and told us to go home, and we hadn't said a word to her, father, truly. So when she drove back again after going to the store, the boys dared me to put Link's eel in her buggy. I thought it was so dead it couldn't hurt her, and I threw it in. Then the eel came to life on the hill, and we heard her scream and saw her jump out. I was awful sorry. That's all, father." It was not quite as bad as Mr. Meredith had feared, but it was quite bad enough. "I must punish you, Carl," he said sorrowfully. "Yes, I know, father. I must whip you." Carl winced. He had never been whipped. Then, seeing how badly his father felt, he said cheerfully, "All right, father." Mr. Meredith misunderstood his cheerfulness, and thought him insensible. He told Carl to come to the study after supper, and when the boy had gone out he flung himself into his chair, and groaned again. He dreaded the evening sevenfold more than Carl did. The poor minister did not even know what he should whip his boy with. What was used to whip boys? Rods? Canes? No, that would be too brutal. A timber switch, then? And he, John Meredith, must hie him to the woods and cut one. It was an abominable thought. Then a picture presented itself, unbidden, to his mind. He saw Mrs. Carr's wizened, nutcracker little face at the appearance of that reviving eel. He saw her sailing witch-like over the buggy wheels. Before he could prevent himself, the minister laughed. Then he was angry with himself, and angrier still with Carl. He would get that switch at once, and it must not be too limber after all. Carl was talking the matter over in the graveyard with Faith and Una, who had just come home. They were horrified at the idea of his being whipped, and by father, who had never done such a thing. But they agreed soberly that it was just. "You know it was a dreadful thing to do," sighed Faith. "And you never owned up in the club." "I forgot," said Carl. "Besides, I didn't think any harm came of it. I didn't know she jarred her legs. But I'm to be whipped, and that will make things square." "Will it hurt very much?" said Una, slipping her hand into Carl's. "Oh, not so much, I guess," said Carl gamely. "Anyhow, I'm not going to cry, no matter how much it hurts. It would make father feel so bad if I did. He's all cut up now. I wish I could whip myself hard enough, and save him doing it." After supper, at which Carl had eaten little, and Mr. Meredith nothing at all, both went silently into the study. The switch lay on the table. Mr. Meredith had had a bad time getting a switch to suit him. He cut one, then felt it was too slender. Carl had done a really indefensible thing. Then he cut another. It was far too thick. After all, Carl had thought the eel was dead. The third one suited him better, but as he picked it up from the table, it seemed very thick and heavy, more like a stick than a switch. "Hold out your hand," he said to Carl. Carl threw back his head and held out his hand unflinchingly. But he was not very old, and he could not quite keep a little fear out of his eyes. Mr. Meredith looked down into those eyes. Why, they were Cecilia's eyes, her very eyes, and in them was the self-same expression he had once seen in Cecilia's eyes when she had come to him to tell him something she had been a little afraid to tell him. Here were her eyes in Carl's little white face, and 6 weeks ago he had thought, through one endless, terrible night, that his little lad was dying. John Meredith threw down the switch. "Go," he said. "I cannot whip you." Carl fled to the graveyard, feeling that the look on his father's face was worse than any whipping. "Is it over so soon?" asked Faith. She and Una had been holding hands and setting teeth on the Pollock tombstone. He didn't whip me at all," said Carl with a sob. "And I wish he had. And he's in there, feeling just awful." Una slipped away. Her heart yearned to comfort her father. As noiselessly as a little grey mouse, she opened the study door and crept in. The room was dark with twilight. Her father was sitting at his desk. His back was towards her. His head was in his hands. He was talking to himself, broken, anguished words. But Una heard and understood, with the sudden illumination that comes to sensitive, unmothered children. As silently as she had come in, she slipped out and closed the door. John Meredith went on, talking out his pain in what he deemed his undisturbed solitude. End of chapter 33.